Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about floods, removing dams and levees from our rivers and waterways, and recreating floodplains with my guest, Tim Palmer. He is an author of over 32 books about rivers, the environment, and adventure travel. He was a former county land use planner. He's been a writer for major newspapers, a photographer, and is a river conservation activist. His most current book is Seek Higher Ground, the natural solution to our urgent flooding crisis. He has won many awards, including the Conservation Achievement Award as Communicator of the Year from the National Wildlife Federation, the Lifetime Achievement Award from American Rivers, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Award from the River Management Society, the Distinguished Alumni Award from Penn State University College of Arts and Architecture, and the Ansel Adams Award for Photography from the Sierra Club. His books of text and photos have garnered the National Outdoor Book Award, the Independent Publisher Book Award, the Indie Fab Adventure Book of the Year, and the IBPA Benjamin Franklin Award, among others. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on Environmental Directions.
Hey, Nancy, thank you. I'm happy to be here and eager to talk about flooding with you.
Well, let's hope that if everybody hears what you have to say about floods, we might not have so many flooding disasters. Your book was absolutely a superb, researched, well-written documentation of how in the last century and a half our policies have created worse flooding disasters than they need to. I was just amazed at what you discovered in terms of what has been going on and what needs to be done. Let's begin with the issue of floods. We know with climate change that they are becoming worse than they ever were, and that what used to be the 100-year flood that was planned for by cities and counties and other agencies really is happening practically every other year. Do you find that we are still not recognizing that maybe instead of spending trillions of dollars to help disaster relief with people and places getting flooded, that maybe they might start thinking that we need to create the floodplains and the natural open space to let rivers and estuaries and other waterways do their natural flow?
Yeah, absolutely, Nancy. It sounds like you have read the book.
Superb book.
That's really wonderful to know, about my interviewer. But yes, the fundamental story here is that we have tried desperately to stop floods from occurring by building dams and to keep the floods away from us by building levees. Billions of dollars going down each of those paths, billions more on relief, just trying to take away a little bit of the suffering after the flood occurs. Meanwhile, we've almost ignored the very fundamental task of simply staying out of the way. And we need to do that by protecting open space on floodplains that remains. And that's critical because 90% of our floodplains are not heavily developed yet. This problem could get 9 times worse than it is. We need to protect open space that remains on floodplains. And number 2, we need to help people move away from the flood hazards and be done with them whenever people are willing to go.
Most people are afraid of floods. We talk about flooding disasters, the negative value of floods, how much we have to take care of people, but there are positive values. I think in one of your chapters you talked about how great it was that a dam disappeared and the salmon returned and wildlife got back to its normal state.
Exactly. Nancy, there's a whole other side to this flooding coin. It's not all about destruction and mayhem. Floods are actually essential to the way nature works. High water has always happened, and natural systems have evolved to deal with that. Fish need floods for healthy rivers. groundwater deposits, which half of us depend on it for our drinking water, need floods because that's where the water soaks into the ground. Floods are what wash sand down to our ocean beaches and restore it there, while the beach sand that was there is washed away by ocean currents. So if we like beaches, you got to like floods. If we like fish, you have to like floods. If you like drinking water, you have to like floods, because they are critical natural elements to all of these processes of nature.
An important point. We all must like floods. There are thousands of miles of rivers that should be able to flood, to be able to overflow their normal path when there are excessive rains or snow melts. And yet, among those thousands of miles, the solution in the past has been to build dams, but those dams aren't necessarily safe.
That's right. The Army Corps of Engineers has built 400 major flood control dams. States and local entities have built others. The idea was to stop floods from occurring. That has worked to a degree. I'm not saying here that all of that was a mistake, or certainly not that the strategies of the past were done in any sort of bad faith. People at the time thought they were doing the right thing. But the floods continued to occur. The flood damages continued to get worse almost every year, no matter how much we spent on those approaches. And now the floods are getting much worse. As you said, because of climate change, a heating climate, the storms are getting greater, more intense, more widespread. The floods will be bigger. The floods of tomorrow will dwarf the floods of the past. And that is really the reason I wrote the book when I did. My original kind of motivation on this field was being a flood victim back in 1972.
Hurricane Agnes in 1972.
Yes, but I was right at ground zero of that flood. I also happened to be the environmental planner for the largest county in Pennsylvania at the time. So after the flood and, getting out of the little Appalachian village where I lived, finally, once the roads cleared, bridges were out, landslides were down, the water raged. I made it back to work in a week, and then my job was not only to become engaged in the recovery efforts, but more important, to figure out how to avoid a catastrophe like that in the future. And that was the seed that germinated and grew in my following experience as a county planner, and then in years of writing about rivers and river conservation, and now in this book that has just come out this year. Now, the heating climate has made the specter of increasing floods inevitable. And so while denial may have worked as our MO in the past, it is not going to work in the future. Floods are simply going to be too great.
Your subtitle of Seek Higher Ground refers to the natural solution to our urgent flooding crisis. Is that solution letting rivers and coastlines have their open space, their floodplain, their estuaries?
Exactly, Nancy. The natural solution is to get out of the way wherever we can. And when we do that, we not only eliminate flood damage, but we acknowledge the value of rivers and the value of flooding, which serves many ecological processes that are critical to us.
You describe how people have a false sense of security living behind levees that have been built and thinking that that's going to protect them. And yet the rivers do overflow the levees, or the levees break. And when people buy in these floodplains that they think are not floodplains because they don't see watery land, the real estate people aren't required to even let them know that they're in a floodplain.
That's correct. Yeah. Here's how it happened, Nancy. The floods occur. They have since the beginning of time. We're not going to change that. Some people like to live next to the river. It was cheap real estate. It was the path of commerce. They like the view, whatever the reasons. So people love to settle there. People, and particularly development interests, lobbied their Congress people to support the Army Corps of Engineers by authorizing the Corps to build flood control dams upstream. upstream to make it safer for new development downstream. They did that, and to justify those dams, they have to show that they are protecting investments downstream. So actually, the more development below the dams, the better as far as the Corps was concerned, because it justified yet more projects. So people think they're safe, they build up even more. Turns out they're not safe because the little and medium-sized flood gets stopped, but the big ones don't. The levees protect you from the small flood events, but many of them get overtopped or eroded in the really big ones. And so that justifies yet more investment with this false belief that we can actually control nature. Again, my approach is we need to recognize we cannot really control nature. We have to do a better job at taking personal responsibility and community responsibility for letting rivers flood where they're going to flood.
In your book, Seek Higher Ground, you mention a couple of individuals. I think one was with the Army Corps of Engineers, another was a director of FEMA at one time, who recognized that this approach of building dams and levees is not the solution, that the solution is to buy out people, relocate them to higher ground, and create the open space. And you have a whole chapter about communities that have done so, and those open space recreation areas, wildlife refuges are so well accepted by the community and appreciated, and it actually saves money.
Right.
But those individuals who pointed this solution out were ignored by the majority of policymakers.
Totally, yes. Even back in the late 1800s, federal studies of watersheds, including the Mississippi and the Sacramento rivers, found that we should be avoiding development there. That was totally ignored at the time and continued to be so. Even the Army Corps opposed building dams for flood control up until the Flood Control Act of 1936. The Corps believed that levees were the way to go, and only levees. So they built levees. The levees continued to get overtopped. Eventually, Congress pushed the Corps to build dams also. The Corps adopted that job with relish, proceeded to build a dam wherever they could. As I said, the damages continued to rise. So this other approach was advocated even by officials in the Corps way back when. It was ignored. The movement to protect floodplains as open space kind of began in a bigger way in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with a hydrologist named Gilbert White. That movement grew through the 70s with an improved federal flood insurance program, yet still the damages continue to be worse because we don't do enough of that job of protecting open space and helping people to relocate.
I have personal experience with the Santa Ana River. I grew up in Orange County. I rode my horse in the river. When I was a child, it had already been straightened. There was already homes behind the levees. They did create a small golf course that gets flooded during the hard rains, but then it becomes back into a golf course. It made sense. But then in the 80s, they decided to actually pave the river. In the Santa Ana Canyon, they literally moved the river to put in the highway, to build homes, to build offices and other commercial operations in the floodplain.
Sure.
They hadn't learned.
No, it's a very common story, Nancy. Now, you also mentioned that there are success stories of people who recognize this problem and the validity of this other approach. Places no less than Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville Metro government has a very happening program. They do not permit new development in high-hazard floodways at all. They have an amazing program of helping people relocate. They've relocated 400 homes so far. They have another 300 to go to get rid of the properties that are flooded most repeatedly, the really worst ones. Charlotte, North Carolina has a great program. Tulsa, Oklahoma has a great program. Where I worked in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, they have a buyout program where they help people to move where they're willing to go. There are success stories here as well. And one of the really wonderful things about them is the popularity of them after the work is done, because we end up, in many cases, with extremely valuable, extremely popular greenways through our developed areas where the space is allowed for the river to expand and spill over, where we have riparian habitat, which is the best for wildlife. We have trails for hiking and bike riding. We have recreation sites. We have all these amenities that really make life worth living in many of these communities, in lieu of the high-hazard, repeatedly flooded damage that just kind of makes a floodplain ghetto out of these places that get just hammered repeatedly. So that is clearly the way to go here, and that's the case I make in the book.
You have so much valuable information in your excellent book, Seek Higher Ground, The Natural Solution to Our Urgent Flooding Crisis. And we're going to talk more about these issues when we return in a moment with my guest, Tim Palmer.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Tim Palmer, who is an author of over 32 books about rivers, the environment, and adventure travel. Tim, your most recent book, Seek Higher Ground, really makes it clear that the United States, as well as many other countries, aren't doing what is necessary to handle floods. And we know the floods are getting worse because of the climate crisis. While you focused on the United States, you did mention how the Netherlands actually plans for a 3,000-year flood as opposed to the United States for that 100-year flood, which really should be 500 years or 1,000 years. But other countries like Bangladesh, you have thousands of people in floodplains with no place else to go. And you mentioned that really there's going to be sort of an environmental refugee crisis with people suffering from floods.
Yes, exactly. You know, it's going to make the immigration crisis of today look like a practice session here. The climate refugees of the future will number in the millions. There are a lot of citations for that, which are in my book. Places like Bangladesh, it's not thousands, it's millions of people who will be subject to danger, and it's growing all the time. I don't really talk about their issues and what they should be doing. That's way beyond my scope. But one thing we should be doing is providing a model to the rest of the world on how to correctly approach this problem. And unfortunately, we're not doing that. We, too, have done too much of the wrong thing, not enough of the right thing.
Most of our land, though, is not flood prone. And so we do have options to move people to higher ground, to also create these open spaces that are so necessary. A lot of the levees, particularly in California, were created for farmland, but I enjoyed your comment in your book where you said it's not flooded farmland, but farmed floodplain.
That's right. Yeah, the floods, of course, came first. We've added farming to that, and of course there are consequences from that. A couple of those numbers, Nancy, 90% of the floodplains are not heavily developed. It'll get worse if we don't protect that open space. Only 7% of America actually floods at a hazard level, so there are a lot of other places to go. 93% of the land is not floodplain, and a lot of that is suitable for development, and we should be focusing on channeling our investments there rather than on the 7% where we're guaranteed to have problems in the future.
But unfortunately, the way we have the system established for declaring disasters, all the taxpayers are literally spending billions and billions of dollars to help out people to continuously rebuild their homes or their properties, right, when they should be being given the money to relocate and not be ready to have another disaster on the property.
Yes, but two more interesting figures. The Natural Resources Defense Council cranked thousands of data points and determined that for every $1.70 that the federal government spends helping people to move and be away from the flood problem and finished with it forever. We, taxpayers, spend $100 helping people stay where they will get flooded again. And we do that through, of course, relief, after floods, and you can't argue against that. People are suffering. We have to help them. But relief, we do it through a heavily subsidized federal flood insurance program. It was a brilliant idea, but it hasn't gone too well. The program is $22 billion in debt, so we spend that $100, on that and on other measures to help people, quote, flood-proof their buildings, but there are a lot of problems. We have a difficult time really flood-proofing a house.
But that insurance is not being bought by most people, and you mentioned that only about 50 of about 250 Native American tribes have bought into it.
Right. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was widely recognized that a lot of people were exposed to flood hazards, and they could not afford insurance. The insurance industry is very well informed, and they know it would take an enormous monthly premium to pay for the damages that are inevitable. We all insure ourselves many of us should insure ourselves for fire. Floods are far more widespread, far more damaging, far more inevitable than fires. So it's a bad economic model. So to compensate for that, Congress adopted a national flood insurance program intended to subsidize or help the people who are already victims of floods many times for no fault of their own. But under the condition that the local community also guarantee that the flood damages in that community will not continue to get worse in the future. And you do that by zoning open space so it's not developed, and by requiring extra measures to be taken when development does occur along the fringes of floods. So it was a brilliant idea. I was a county planner at the time this program was bolstered in the early 70s. I think I speak for many when I say we were very excited about what we could expect here. We're finally going to deal effectively with this problem of flooding, but it didn't go so well. The development industries, banking, real estate, home building, got heavily involved in the implementation of the program. The limits on new development got watered down. The enforcement at the local area is often ignored. The mapping is way inadequate. So for a number of reasons, the program did not succeed in getting a whole lot of people to sign up for flood insurance, as you mentioned. The revenues from it are not nearly adequate for paying for the damages that the government, we taxpayers, pay out. And the standards, such as the 100-year flood area as a base of the hazard zone, have not been nearly adequate because floods continue to get worse. So the program's been disappointing in big ways. A major overhaul is needed, but it would be enough in a way to just fix some really simple things that are no-brainers, like much of the payout for the program go to repeatedly flooded properties. 1% of the flood insurance policies are repeated over and over again by recurring floods, but 30% of the payouts go to those people who are collecting money again and again. That should not be allowed. In Canada, the program is to pay people $100,000 in Ontario for a flood once. And after that, they're on their own. So repeated flood damage would be a simple, common sense, no-brainer thing to solve. Another one would be to require disclosure of flood risks when properties are sold. We do deed searches so the buyer knows they're actually buying the property and they're protected that way. But we don't have a disclosure on flood risk, which the buyer needs to know about.
Your book is full of very detailed examples and studies and places about how floods are being dealt with, and you have excellent documentation. Although reading it, you wouldn't know that it has so much factual information that's been documented. It truly is a fascinating story of what people and communities and the government are doing and not doing. I found it interesting that you describe one community that recognized it's time to relocate, get people out of the floodplain, create the open space, and yet another community says, oh, this is our private property, we can do whatever we want, but yet they want other people, the taxpayers, to bail them out when they continue to get flooded.
Yeah, exactly. Two small communities in Washington state kind of illustrate that dichotomy. The little town of Hamilton, they just get hammered frequently by the Skagit River. A foundation in Seattle, the Forterra Foundation, free of charge, bought the town 45 acres so people could relocate if they want to. And yet, even with that, there's tremendous resistance to moving. And of course, it's fine. People don't want to go. They can stay, but they should be responsible for their decision in that regard and not expect to be bailed out by the taxpayer again and again. In contrast, the little community of Orting on a river south of there, the Puyallup River, people in a mobile home park there who similarly got flooded frequently said, hey, we've had enough. We're done with this. Help us move. The government programs at the state and the federal and local level help them. They got up and out of there. Problem solved.
You also described some early floods in the 1800s, the early 1900s, but you mentioned the almost near disastrous flood a while back here in California with the Oroville Dam.
Right.
That is just reflective of the fact that dams are not necessarily built for the kinds of floods that are coming, and you also pointed out that structurally they have not been reinforced properly, as well as the levees, just as we've discovered with bridge disasters that they are not being structurally reinforced properly.
Right, yeah. This is kind of a slightly a side issue, but certainly heavily related. There are many different kinds of floods, and let's say the most typical is it rains a lot and the water gradually rises. It's kind of a bell curve of hydrology. It crests out and drops. That's the normal flood, and that poses dangers, but you can kind of see them coming and get out of the way, and it's quite predictable how high it will rise and so forth. At the other extreme, we have dam failures, which are the most hazardous form of flooding of all, for the simple reason that we're not getting the runoff from that one rainstorm. We're getting the runoff from sometimes years of combined runoff in that watershed that's been held back in the dam, and then all of it goes at once. So extremely dangerous. The most dangerous flood in American history, Johnstown in Pennsylvania, killed 2,000 people. Typically, the most fatal floods per year are from dam failures. In America, we have 90,000 sizable dams that have been built. And again, only 400 of those are Army Corps flood control projects. And those are in relatively good condition. But many of these other dams are unmaintained. In many cases, the owners cannot even be found. There's profound safety issues here. And while we funded dam construction kind of without limits, even when cost overruns ran 300% and 400%. Nobody batted an eye at that in Congress. Now we're barely funding dam safety at all. And yet that is one of the big safety concerns of the future.
You make it so clear that the policies of the past have not taken care of the crises that we are confronting in the future in terms of floods and this kind of disaster. Some of it may be called a natural disaster, but human-made activities have really turned the natural disasters into human-made disasters. You have documented this so well and written so many important stories that we should all be aware of in your new book, Seek Higher Ground, The Natural Solution to Our Urgent Flooding Crisis. I urge everyone to get a copy and read this work because your attitude and ideas about what should be done to deal with this environmental crisis will certainly change after reading this book.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Let me try to wrap this up. What I see as the really fundamental issue here, and that is that floods are the ultimate teacher of one of life's greatest lessons. We regard the laws of nature as optional, when in fact they're absolute. Meanwhile, we regard our own habits and laws and policies as absolute, when in fact we can change them whenever we have the collective will to do so. In our minds, we've perfectly reversed the way the world actually works. And nowhere is this predicament and its consequences as clear for all to see as in the floods that are now growing greater and greater with nearly every year.
We've run out of time for you to talk about every example that you've presented in your book. How do you sum it up, and how do people contact you and get more information?
The story of floods and what we do about them is really a story of nature and people. It's a story of culture and economics and engineering, of ecology and equity, of policy and politics. It's much more than the story of destruction and mayhem that we so often hear about. It's really a story of life in America in the year 2024. And it's all set on this panoramic backdrop of our rivers, streams, and storms at their most vital and dramatic and consequential. There's just nothing like it. So I hope you enjoy this book. You can see it at my website, timpalmer.org. The University of California Press is the publisher.
And the website, timpalmer.org, is timpalmer.org. Thank you so very much for bringing awareness to this issue. Thank you for being my guest.
You're welcome, Nancy. It's been great to be with you. Thank you for the chance to talk about this important issue.
And I look forward to talking with you about some of your other excellent books as well.
Thank you, Nancy.
I have been speaking with Tim Palmer, who is a writer, photographer, river conservation activist, author of over 32 books, including Seek Higher Ground, the Natural Solution to Our Urgent Flooding Crisis. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.